apologizing for joining you guys late. I had other meeting that was ongoing and it took over time, but I'll do my best to deliver this particular discussion as we move into it. So I'll be sharing my screen. Let me know when you can see my screen. Let me know when you can see it.
I can see it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk about the case for regulatory system strengthening to advance pharmaceutical research and development in Africa. And just to give a brief background about what we are, what we do as African Pharmaceutical Network, this is a network that is key on bringing together pharmaceutical industry professionals, stakeholders, and organizations in the sector. And the main thing is to build capability in them through knowledge sharing, policy shaping to ensure that we draft policies, and also to promote innovations and partnership within the African pharmaceutical industry. And all these is towards ensuring there's reliable access to safe, effective, and quality medicines for African people in the continent. So in that case, then how do we deliver on that? There's technical support and vital services, knowledge sharing, where we have training program that we've curated and delivering at the moment, including a regulatory affairs training program, which is currently running. And beyond that, then the next phase is to facilitate stakeholder engagements and partnerships where we're able to work together as an industry on that front. So based on that kind of work that we are doing and the kind of regulatory landscape that we have in Africa, one of the key bits that we're asking ourselves is how do we contribute from a regulatory system strengthening, but at the same time, what is the essence of regulatory system strengthening in pharmaceutical research and development in Africa? And to a greater extent, this session and this conversation is driven by some of the work that I've noted that H3D is doing in Africa, which is commendable in terms of advancing research and development in the pharmaceutical industry. But the question is, why is it that we are not able to attain our capacity as a continent in delivering in our R&D portfolio and developing innovative quality medicines within the African landscape? But rather we are more dependent on imports, even for the small generic molecules from the international community, rather than developing them locally. So on that account, then the starting point is understanding the pharmaceutical R&D life cycle. Before medicine, let's say medicine X comes to the market, there has to be an idea target for what the product can do. So we have the drug discovery cycle within the first phase. So there's the synthesis. Initially, we have to identify a molecule that you believe could have value in treating a particular disease. You look at the drug discovery, where you look into synthesis for the drug, lead compound optimization to ensure that whether the product has a problem in particular molecules, you need to introduce new binding sites, whichever it is, or even a new components in terms of chemical reaction. That is the lead compound optimization to ensure that it will bind to the receptor if it's working on the receptor to be able to treat the condition that it should be treating. Then we do further screening and biologic evaluation, which can be in the labs in test tubes, or we can move forward in ensuring that we can have a product that is effective and of the right quality. Then that is in terms of developing the product, the drug discovery. We need to discover the product and ensure that the molecule itself has the capability to be able to deliver on its value. And that is the component where we are now able to say we have this lead molecule that can be used, and that lead molecule that can be used will be moved to the next phase of product development and use in clinical settings and all that. So that is a critical bit. Then after that initial phase of drug discovery research, we have a new drug candidate, and that new drug candidate has to be formulated into a particular chemical that can now be used. And that is where we'll be moving to the next phase, because I know most of the conversation that we've been having around research and development has been around clinical trials, and especially this was led by the COVID-19 pandemic, research on vaccines and all that. But then we initially, after the drug discovery, we have molecule X. The molecule X can treat a particular disease, and it's now being taken to test and being tried in actually addressing the condition and being formulated in the medicine form. Because if it's a medicine, it has to be able to be carried and transported from the site to the patient who are using it. It has to withstand certain chemical conditions and environmental conditions and all that. So that is where we'll now move with the new drug candidate to the process chemistry bit. And in the process chemistry, we are looking at having whether the chemical features of the product makes it safe for use in human populations. The chemistry ensure that it does particular sets of reactions that might be making it not safe or safe to the use in particular populations. Two, for us to be able to come up with a product, we need to ask ourselves, is it able to be reproduced over time? Do we have a way of chemically generating it rather than extracting it if it was an extract? That is where the chemistry research also comes in, where you're seeing, can we actually have chemical reactions to come up with a product? After that is phase of the identification and we have the optimal molecule that we use, we go to formulation research. What excipients are needed to build on the chemical for it to be able to, one, be stable, be dissoluble in a particular condition where it's going to be used. So that is the formulation research. Is it going to be an injectable? Is it going to be a solid dosage form, a tablet, a capsule? Whichever way, we need to be able to establish the kind of formulation that it will be formed into and how it's going to be used in the ultimate patient population that need to use that product. That is critical. Then the physical properties analysis and research of the product, where we're now seeing it will dissolve, it will be stable in particular conditions, it needs particular packaging in terms of the containers and all that. So once we finalize on that first bit, we move to the safety component, where we're looking at how safe is the molecule that has been formulated. That is been the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic features that need to be assessed. What is the absorption levels when it's consumed? Let's say, for example, it's swallowed in as a tablet. What is the movement within the penetration into body tissues if it's injected as an injectable? And what are the different parameters that would in fact that? So the biopharmaceutical features, bioequivalence, bioavailability, and all that kind of considerations are put in place in this particular component to ensure that it is able to get to the site of action and it will get there in the right levels as is needed to treat that particular condition. So those are critical considerations. So once that is done within this phase where we have the chemistry bit and the safety bit of it, we have now a molecule, and that molecule is believed to have the stability features that is required. It has the formulation safety considerations. Some of them might be done. That is where we have the pre-lab non-clinical research work that could be done in animals and all that. Then after that, we've now moved it to the clinical setting, that is introducing it in use in human populations and human subjects. And for that case, we have the research and development component where we're looking at from phase 1 studies using a small population of patients. They don't have to be really sick patients unless you're dealing with novel therapies, and especially those are that very toxic, like anti-cancer medicines. Then from there, we move to phase 2 studies, where we'll definitely be considering using patients suffering from the condition, but in smaller numbers to just establish the efficacy of the drug in that population. That is exploratory case where we are exploring the effectiveness of the drug. Then we move to phase 3 studies. In phase 3, we are looking at larger populations or patient populations, but then aim is to confirm the efficacy of the product. If it is confirmed to be effective in that large population, both randomized and non-randomized trials and all that, we're able to now confirm that the molecule that we identified at the idea target developed it through the drug discovery research in the lab works and all the processing chemistry bit, formulated it into a molecule that is either a tablet, a capsule, an injectable solution, or a concentrate for infusion, whatever it is okay. We've taken it through the human trials, the clinical research component. Now it has passed that test. After passing that test, it has to be submitted for review and approval to be registered by the health authorities across that chain. Once it is reviewed and approved, we have phase 4 clinical studies that is now looking at the safety of the product in real life use across the world in the different populations. But then that the product is now introduced into the market, it's going to be sold. Some of them will come in terms of donations, development partner guided programs, whichever way it goes. Now it is in the market. In this particular phase, there's also other activities that will definitely be taking place. And in the post-approval, post-surveillance and phase 3 studies, we're talking about pharmacovigilance recalls can be happening there, health authority guidance and directives can be coming as well. So that is the whole life cycle, pharmaceutical research and development life cycle, until the point the product is in the market. But when it is in the market, there are also other research and development activities that are happening. You find one product was developed to treat heart failure, but now it's being used to treat another condition altogether. There has been research where we've seen actually the molecule in it can target another can bind on another target itself. And if it binds on that alternative target, that would help us in treating another disease that we did not envision at the initial phase. So that is already still part of the research work that is ongoing in that particular case. So research starts from coming up with the idea of the problem that is being solved across the value chain to a product that is available in the market, and it is being optimized and being developed and advanced. And the aim of research and development in the last phase, when the product is in the market, either to get new indications, to change the indication of the product, or to improve the safety and efficacy of the product, or even the suitability for use. And that is why you'll find a product came as it. We have single molecules in the market, but now they're being formulated into fixed dose combinations and all that, which means that product moved from this phase into the formulation research component to establish how can we formulate in that case. And definitely would be a convenience of the patient, reliability of use, and all those factors. So looking at all that pharmaceutical research and development life cycle, you'd be asking yourself, where does regulatory affairs come in? Regulatory affairs is into that particular pipeline as it is across the chain. Because the first thing before, when you're coming up with your idea as it starts, you need to take it to the different phases. And that takes me to this second slide. This is where the research component is working. You've come up with a molecule, you've reviewed it and all that. When you're doing those chemical reactions, they have to be conducted in a particular set standards. And that is why we have good laboratory practices. We have good good manufacturing practices. How did you manufacture the chemicals that you're going to test, whether it's in animals or in lab settings? We have good clinical practices. So you have all the GCPs, the GXP functions that are part of the research component to ensure that you can validate the activities and the function that you performed in your research work, from identifying the molecule, processing the molecule, to becoming a formulation, a molecule that can be used in clinical setting and can be used in human populations. That is the first phase. So then after that, when you now move to the next phase, when talking about after the new drug formulation has been established, you've adopted the good laboratory, good manufacturing, and good clinical practices in an animal setting, non-human settings, you move to the clinical phase, where now we talk about clinical trials. In case of clinical trials, there's the documentation that needs to be supplied. If you have the molecule, there is a dossier, and that is the investigational medicinal product dossier, IMPD. And in that investigational medicinal product dossier, we need regulatory affairs professionals, and the scientists to develop the dossier that is meeting the regulatory requirements for it to be evaluated. Is it the right molecule? Does it have the binding facility properties? The physical and the chemical features, are they suited for what we are hoping for? Then that dossier has been compiled. Then now we compile the research protocol as it should be. That is still part of regulation. So the clinical trial protocol has been developed, and the clinical trial dossier for the molecule that is being tested, it has to be submitted to regulatory authorities to review and establish that actually the research would be conducted according to good clinical practices. It meets the regulatory requirements, and therefore it's worthwhile and actually viable to be taken to the market. The clinical affairs component would come in terms of developing the clinical trial strategy, the safety of the patient population as is necessary, the suitability and compliance with the standard practices that is good for us. Then all these other aspects, pediatric investigation plan, if you're looking at investigating the product in pediatric populations, there are regulations, and pediatric populations, the elderly, pregnant populations would be considered as at risk population, and they're also special populations. So for you to be able to conduct trials on them, it has to have been validated in other trials, and that is part of regulation. Because when you look at the aspect and the aim of regulatory affairs and regulation of products and technologies within the pharma life chain is to ensure, one, we are safeguarding public health interest. But as much as we are safeguarding public health interest and ensuring they are safe and they have only access to safe products, we're also working to ensure they have access to the products that will make them enjoy the privileges and rights in being alive, but also achieving the right to health, which is a clear requirement. So if the medicines need to be there, then access should be a driver. But the access should be to safe, effective, and quality products across the value chain, which is critical for us. So during the research component, that is the research component that we talked about, then giving scientific advice and all. After the research component has been done and the product is now being taken for a registration, because the ultimate aim of research and developing a product is to take it to the market, because the people you are designing for are looking for and expecting that product to help them alleviate their symptoms and help them get cure when they are unwell for particular conditions. So in that case, then your key contribution in the management is to have the product registered. Regulatory component is submitting the final dossier with the clinical research trial data from phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, which will now be evaluated by regulatory agencies and regulatory authorities. So you work on the submission strategy, you make the submission, follow up to get the approval. Once approval has been granted, the next phase of your work starts. And at that point, when of approval, you also have to show the good manufacturing practice criteria has been met. That is for now the final formulation, not the chemical that you're working on within the research component. So you have a manufacturing facility, the trial manufacturing processes have been validated and approved. Now you've that to that phase. At the commercialization phase, regulatory affairs will still come in. How are you advertising the product? Are you advertising to the general public, or are you advertising to healthcare professionals? If you're advertising to healthcare professionals, what is the expected outcomes? You're advertising to patients, what are the expected outcomes, and how are you regulating to ensure there's no irrational use of this product? For example, when you're dealing with controlled medicines and controlled products, all these are components of what regulatory affairs would look like. In case of safety-related incidences, how do we control for that? The GXP functions. So that is where also regulatory affairs and regulatory control and regulation of medicines and products would come into space. Then if you registered in one market, you want to extend the indication, either adding additional indication, submitting in other markets, how do you ensure that happens? There are new regulatory pathways. We're talking about recognition, reliance, and all that. Then finally, if you intend to withdraw the market, is it being withdrawn for safety reasons, because lack of commercial interest, whatever it is, that is still being regulated and being controlled. And across the life cycle of the product, you submit variation, you submit renewals. So on that scope, you already have another view of what where regulatory affairs plays within the product life cycle. And as it plays across the product life cycle, all those have an interface with the product research and development cycle, as it should be. So based on that, you'd ask yourself, why should we be interested in research and development in Africa? And I selected a couple of pointers and a couple of ideas that I think would be critical for us to acknowledge within the African context, but also to understand why we need to invest. The reason as to why we do pharmaceutical research and development is to develop new molecules and new therapies that are going to address needs in the medical fraternity and medical space. And those needs definitely are driven by diseases that people are suffering from. So when you look at the current disease burden in Africa, we account for 25% of the global disease burden. And with the 25% of the global disease burden, one key thing that is clear, we are still importing more than 75% of medicines in Africa, which is a pointer we need to look at. Then the greatest disease burden, when you look at the proportion of all the diseases we have, infectious, non-infectious diseases, neglected tropical diseases, and all those, infectious diseases account for 70% of deaths in Africa annually. Do we have treatments of these infectious diseases? Do we have alternative cures for these diseases? How does that work for us? Then another thing that is clear for us is there is a rapidly rising burden of non-communicable diseases in Africa, and that is associated with some of the living conditions, lifestyle changes, urbanization, and all that. So we have a substantial disease burden, which means there's a diseases that need to be treated in Africa. We have therapies that are already conventional and are available. Can we have improvements on those treatments to make them more convenient, more accessible to patients? And two, can we develop new therapies and new solutions that can treat our populations and our patients? That would be critical to understand from a disease burden perspective. Then we have antimicrobial resistance. This is a global health issue and a global health threat that we need to look at. But as we look at it, the burden of antimicrobial resistance is substantial in Africa and definitely developing countries across the globe. And Africa consists most actually with the majority of the developing economies and developing countries. Therefore, there's need for us to play a role and look at why is it that we have a higher burden of antimicrobial resistance, and why would that be an incentive for us to do research and development? The incentive is because, one, we suffer from most infectious diseases. Infectious diseases are caused by microbial pathogens. And in that case, then we need antimicrobials to be able to treat them. If there's a growing burden of resistance, it means we will not be able to treat them. And if you're talking about 70% of deaths in Africa being driven by infectious diseases, over time it might be even higher when the resistance has developed and we're not able to cure ourselves. So there's a need for us to invest in research and development, both to tackle the burden of antimicrobial resistance, to reverse the gains, but also to develop new antimicrobials that can attack and actually help us in treating new infections and ongoing infections that are developing resistance to the current therapies. Then antimicrobial stewardship programs in Africa are still very nascent and very underdeveloped. When you look at it, I would say recently I was doing some research and some study on the extent to which we have antimicrobial stewardship programs in our country. And the starting point was to see whether our hospitals have antibiograms, these antibiograms in their hospitals, to ensure that they're able to do screening, profiling, and actual assessment of these particular pathogens that are affecting their patients as much as possible. Out of in the country, I think we only had 2-3 hospitals that had an hospital antibiogram, which they are using. Of the 3 that have them, the use is relative, and therefore empirical treatment is still key. How does that impact us in antimicrobial stewardship programs? Then we have irrational and inadvertent use of antimicrobials in agricultural activities. Most farmers in Africa are now using antibiotics as growth boosters or some kind of the thing in our context. As much as there's no regulation from the veterinary component, and when you look at the regulatory landscape in Africa, regulation of medicines and access related have been to human products, but limited to the animal component. And that means even practice, even adoption and use of these technologies and these chemicals have not been as regulated. There's need for work in that space. That could be driven from an R&D perspective. The ecological diversity, Africa is one of the most biodiverse continents, basically based on our locationing across the equator region. But at the same time, we have a rich ecological ecosystem where we have more plant population, we have more animals and all that because of our favorable environmental factors and all that. But with that, you have also to acknowledge that there's a growing interest and focus on complementary medicines. And I remember there's a conference that I participated in last year, and the question is, we had our great grandfathers living in Africa before conventional medicines came. They had their ways of treating themselves. How are they doing it? Can we look at researching into these these pathways and these alternative medicines to see how we can actually formulate them into real products and real therapies that we can use? Probably they could help us address some of the challenges we're having. And that is a conversation that we need to be asking ourselves. What possibilities do we have in the continent? How do we take advantage of them? And that would be an important need for us to invest. Technology perspective, there's a growth in technology, and we all acknowledge we now have artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies, and all that. All these are making it easier for us to invest and actually to get into the research and development, because we don't have to do so much. We have already available technologies that can solve our problems and make research easier. I have a laptop at the moment. Maybe 10, 100 years ago, people didn't have laptops in our ecosystem. They could not read already available literature that has been published in other spaces. Now we have these. So how do we take advantage of the technological advancements to have us move forward in our research and development capabilities as a continent? Then the other key thing is limited infrastructure. As much as we've also been talking about underdevelopment and lack of infrastructure as a problem, at this particular moment, when we look at it in the research and development in the pharmaceutical value chain in Africa, it would be actually an advantage in our end, because pharmaceutical research and development needs a lot of resources, and infrastructure, it's very compelling in terms of the investment that needs to be there, substantial. But as much as it's substantial, it means if it didn't exist, it's better to make that investment. If you already had that infrastructure and it's outdated and obsolete with the technological advancements, phasing out what has been in place is not easy, meaning we would still be stuck with the old archaic models and technologies that are available. But because of that limited infrastructure, it's an opportunity for us to start afresh and start from a higher level, from an advanced perspective. So that is a need for us to now see in the developed world. They're still doing research and development work, but probably they don't have much latitude to start new things because they already had things that were working. In our case, we don't have them. So this is our chance. Are we willing to get into that space? Are we willing to get to start adopting these new technologies and build our own infrastructure in an advanced state rather than going back to the archaic models and archaic processes? That would be good. Then shifting global R&D priorities, when you look at the current landscape in terms of research and development, the focus is on lifestyle diseases, gene therapies, precision medicine, and all. But when you look at the other component on my left, when talking about disease burdens, we're still affected by infectious diseases, meaning the new research and development priorities might not and will not address our needs as a continent. There's need for us to invest in that to ensure that we're able to meet the needs of our local ecosystem and our people as necessary. From a population standpoint, We are accounting for 15% of the global population. And on that account, you have to acknowledge that the greatest population of young people across the world are based in Africa. And with that, that is a resource. These people are ingenious, capable of doing much of the research, leading the development that we are hoping for. And therefore, the question is, do we have the platform to enable them to apply themselves and use their knowledge and the capabilities? So that would be a key thing. So that is a critical aspect that we need to look at. The infectious diseases from a population's perspective, it's about the population that is being impacted by these advances and these challenges. So when you look at these are pointers to why we need to invest in pharmaceutical research and development in Africa. And I hope this serves as a driver for you to ask yourself, how can you get into the space and what can you do? But then somebody would be asking, with all of these, where does regulatory system strengthening come into place? Because that is the question that we were to ask in this conversation. And the question would be, how does regulatory system strengthening play in ensuring there's reliable access to safe, effective, and quality medicines? We know there are unethical practices in the landscape and the ecosystem, and that is why there's limited trust to the pharmaceutical industry and biopharmaceutical sector. How do we bring that trust back? By embracing ethical practices that the society believes in. The only way we can ensure that that guarantee of ethical practices and ethical conduct is by knowing that we have regulations that are in place, and those regulations will ensure that as the pharma company, they're doing the right thing. The other stakeholders within the ecosystem, the clinical trial research association, are doing the right thing, ensuring they do conduct their studies in an ethical way, guided by the good clinical and good laboratory practices, good manufacturing practices. And the physician is prescribing not because there is an influence or an incentive for them, but because it is the right thing to ensure they support their patients. That ethical practice. And that is why you look at COVID-19 during pandemic. Most people were kind of reserved when going to take the vaccines in African context, and that was the vaccine party was being talked about as much as possible. Hesitancies. Why were we hesitant? Because we didn't have that kind of assurance that the research is being done in an ethical way. And it's about us now communicating it to the continent and communicating about what are our regulatory systems levels as a continent to manage and advance this research and development within our local landscape. And if the research and development was done, how far was it? How many people were involved in those kind of research trials and all that? So that ethical practices is critical. And the only way we can guarantee these ethical practices by having standards in place, standing guidelines and operating procedures that will let everybody know what is the benchmark. And in case there's any anomaly, we can hold each other accountable to that. Critical. Then product integrity and security. We all have conversations about falsified counterfeit medicines, substandard products coming into our local markets as much as possible. If those are still coming in, the question is, why would somebody invest in research if the guarantee that the quality product will get to the market is not as much? So we need to ensure that the regulations are in place that will be impeding and actually ensuring that the product that is researched on gets to the market as it needs to be. And therefore, there is an incentive for the investor to invest in research and development. And that is very critical for us. And the other thing that I've just noted that I forgot within the ethical practices component is even the healthcare professionals that are working in research, the ethical practices is, I'm a physician, I'm a pharmacist, I'm working at a pharmacy level somewhere. I've been treating patient A with these medicines, and when through my treatment of the patient, some of them are getting better, some are not getting better. Can I document that? If you don't have controls and regulations around practice, then it means anybody can dispense medicines, anybody can be acting as a quack, but managing patients. Ultimately, they are not able to capture any pointers on any challenges. And that is what we're talking about, the post-marketing surveillance. Do we have the capability as a continent at the moment? That if we don't do that, then it means the idea that a pharmacist might identify in the pharmacy setting where they're practicing to inform the next wave of research and looking at whether that product is really effective as claimed for in the treatment of a particular condition or not will be addressed and will be identified. So those are key bits that we need to look at. Then predictable policy environment. The reason as why we have limited research and development in Africa as well at the moment, if you look at it, were most investment has been by governments, but governments are not investing as much as necessary. The key drivers and key enablers that could fast track research and development in the continent would be the private sector. The private sector would want to invest in a place where they see there is return on investment in my research and development activities. And beyond return investment is, it is a predictive environment where I know if I start this clinical trial, I'll be able to conclude it within the stipulated timelines without having any political instabilities, any regulatory challenges and dynamics that are happening that might impact the quality of the outcomes. So without those predictable policy environment, we are not able to deliver. And the regulatory system strengthening is looking at the regulatory frameworks from legislations in a country to the regulatory frameworks and strategies, regulatory guidance and guidelines in the regional organization or the regulatory authorities, which are critical. So we need to see the value chain as it goes along the chain. And the other bit is around efficiencies in processes. Currently, there's been conversation on African Medicines Agency. And as much as we're talking about establishment of AMA, we need to ask ourselves, what are the advances? What are we benchmarking on? European Medicines Agency has been working for the last over, I think, 50 years or so. And as they've been working on that, now once a product is registered by the EMA, it can have access to more than 27 countries in the European region. How does that help them? Faster access, reduce bottlenecks because they don't have to get approval from each and every country by themselves. But at the same time, they're still safeguarding their local territory because they know if the product has been registered by that strengthened and strong regulatory agency, then we can bank on it, we can trust on it. Two, now with the reliance coming in and recognition, if a product is registered by EMAN, we trust their capabilities because we have standard ethical practices, as we talked about standard guidelines, then we can count on that. We do not have to assign 1,000 assessors to be managing registration of products that have already been registered in that other market. But we can have these assessors working within our own regulatory ecosystem, regulatory agencies to research on new therapies, new technologies that are being fronted. When you look at the landscape in terms of the regulatory capacity of the US FDA, they have research departments and much. How many of African regulatory authorities have those research and development departments to just investigate new technologies, new therapies, new advancements that are coming? Those are still gaps that need to be addressed. And if we're able to look at it from that matrix of ensuring that ethical practices, product integrity and security is in place, predictable policy environment, and efficiencies in practice, we'll be able to drive strong regulatory system that will foster trust and confidence in stakeholders with increased investment in research and development, improved access to and use of innovative products by our population. We don't have to get products just because they're there. We need to get the right quality and innovative products as much as we can. Opening up markets for further research and development because there is possibility, there is opportunity, and that opportunity serves as an incentive for somebody to invest in the local market. Supporting professionalism in practice and improved outcomes of the care because the professional is looking at what works for my patient, what doesn't work, why does it work, and why doesn't the other work? How do we change it? How do we make improvements? And those are key in terms of regulating the business, and ensuring we have a reliable, sustainable environment. The business ecosystem has to be sustainable and efficient. Then finally, promoting best practice sharing and knowledge exchange for innovative approaches. We need to come together and ask ourselves, what is H3D doing better that we can learn on? How do we take those learnings and translate them into new advances that can actually ensure that we have a H3D in South Africa, H3D in Kenya, we have a H3D in Nigeria, Egypt, Uganda, Ghana, and all those countries. Therefore, we know there will be a best practice in developing new therapies in these countries. And these new therapies, after development, will now go to the production phase. Because the other bit around it is after research and development, we have a molecule that could be effective. Do we have the muscle to invest in its production to make it accessible to people? But those are the regulatory bottlenecks. And some of these regulatory bits could be within the pharma space, but could also be beyond the pharma space. And we look at it in this conversation that has been ongoing consistently and repeatedly on Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We have free movement of products and countries are signing the treaty, but at the same time, they're not signing the treaty on free movement of people. Products will not move without the people. If you've researched on a product and the product is available, who will be shipping it from one country to another? We need to ensure that these policies and the regulatory frameworks and legislations are speaking to each other, but at the same time, creating an enabling ecosystem where we see the value in access to care that our people need and investing in the research to bring those solutions to our people in our local context. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation in this session, and I'll be open to questions and discussions as we move along. Over to you, Shruti.